So everybody, welcome back to this third session where we have, very happy to welcome 4 speakers. I think we'll go in the order of the programme. The session is on, broadly speaking, on socio-economic and demographic dynamics, but obviously plays into the wider discussion about future governance of migration. So we have 4 speakers, and first of all, Laura Corrado, who's head of the unit Legal Migration and Integration at DG Home, European Commission. Then we have Rainer Munz, who is advisor on migration and demography in the European Political Strategy Centre within the European Commission. Kris de Meester, who is senior advisor at the Federation of Enterprises in Belgium. And Amanda Klekowski von Koppenfels, who's a senior lecturer in migration and politics at the Brussels School of International Studies, which is part of the University of Kent. So 10 minutes each, and we'll begin with Laura. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Andrew. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm very glad to be here. I had prepared also a short introduction, but I think I'll not entirely follow it while remaining short, because I have listened to very interesting, of course, discussion in the previous panel, and I would like to also to react to some of them and to give also the viewpoint of an official who is in the firing line, as it was said previously, because indeed we are somehow, especially dealing with legal migration and integration. So I would like also to say something about how this is perceived from inside and what are the challenges, but also the things that we have managed to do, nevertheless. Well, I think on the questions were more about the socio-economic impact, but I think the data are clear, and I'm not the expert, Rainer and others are, but I think if you look at the data on demography, economic data about the shortages at all skills level, I think the case is very clear. I mean, whatever one may think, if we look at the pure facts and figures, I think well-managed labor migration, which doesn't mean uncontrolled migration, which doesn't mean millions and billions, but it means migration to address economic migration, labor migration to address the needs that we have is certainly needed to different degrees in different member states. The economic situations are different, also the demographics are different, but I think overall, if we take Europe together, there are certainly needs, and also I think we can see, without having the time to get into that this is positive also for the countries from which the migrants come from, especially if you're looking at the other side of the Mediterranean, North African country, the Maghreb, where there are young and often educated people that want to migrate, for often not only for work but also for studies, and then they can go back and bring back know-how and so on. So I think this is, if we just look at the facts, at economics, this is pretty straightforward I think for the majority of people at least. But of course, we have heard before, then comes politics, then come public perceptions, and things become more complicated, and indeed they have. I think, and this I will not go into the details because this has been mentioned before, about factual situations of about I think more than 180,000 arrivals, spontaneous arrivals through the Mediterranean, Central Mediterranean route through Libya, from and through Libya, which as of course, to a lesser extent, but also flows through other routes. And this has of course posed challenges to what we call in jargon the frontline states, well, in specifically Italy. But also other kind of challenges when people have moved to other member states or have been relocated, because some people have been relocated, not as many as the Commission would have liked, but have been relocated in terms of their receptions and then first integration measures and longer-term integration measures. So there's been a difficult, and there is a difficult factual situation. I think Eugenio Ambrosi also this morning explained very well how difficult it is to deal with Libya, with the situation in Libya. So I don't need to go into that, but there is a factual difficult situation, I think. We can call it crisis or not, but it is difficult. There is a question also of public perceptions. I think we can discuss. I have read the interesting paper produced also by MPC about perceptions, and where overall, if you look at least in a bit in the longer term, the perceptions are relatively stable. But I think if we look at the media impact also of what has happened in the last 2-3 years in countries like Italy, and also how this has influenced the political debate. I think the impact has been big also in part of the public opinion on how they perceive asylum, refugees and migrants in general. So this is just, to start with. Now, what is the situation? Why is it difficult at EU level? And is it true what has been said now? There is no longer the community methods and everything is decided by the European Council. Well, I think that it is true that the issues have become very highly politicized because they are highly political, because they are important, they matter for national elections, they matter to national governments, national politicians. And of course, certainly the European Council has had a very important role. At the same time, I think what the Commission has been trying to do was also not to be the mere executor of the European Council, but to play a very active role in also shaping the policies and the decisions to be taken. And this is what the Political Commission is about. Mainly. And I think to a certain extent this has also led the Commission to go into territories where we hadn't gone so far, at least not in this area, so to really do the crisis management, almost being involved in the daily management with setting up of the hotspots, which we contributed to also to set up and to help. We have moved, at least partly, I would say, as Commission to a sort of more operational way of functioning, which is not easy for an institution which is traditionally a policy-making institution, which is the guardian of the treaty. So this has complicated things even more. But I think it has been essential for the Commission also to remain relevant at European level, not to leave the whole space to the European Council. Now, another very important point that was made this morning, and I agree with that, is that, of course, if you put it back to the intergovernmental level, then you don't have always the tools to ensure enforcement. And this is where also is the added value of the Commission to a certain extent, because we did launch, in fact, a few days ago, infringement procedures against 3 of the Visegrad countries for not implementing the relocation decision. Okay, it was maybe, some will think it was long overdue, but we did it. We brought them to court. Of course, there is a pending case before the Court of Justice about the legality of the whole relocation decisions. We shall see in September, October. I think, and this is very important, I think that we did it because I think symbolically, I think the way, the behavior of certain member states who somehow revendicated the right to decide not to accept refugees, showed a big fracture, a big divisions at European level, and also has led a very poisonous debate within the European Council amongst member states, which has also led, I'm not saying this is a decision being taken, also to discussions about funding, which I think are they hurt even more than infringement procedures to a certain extent. So several member states, and I think also some commissioners have said, well, you receive European funds, then you have to be always a full member state and also participate to be solidar with other member states also in other areas. So I think this is also something that has emerged very strongly and which shows again how political the issue is. So I think in this context, it is very difficult to develop rational policies on legal and particularly on labor migration, which is what my little unit within DG Home in the European Commission has been trying to do, not only in the past few years, but even before. I think that certainly the overall context has made it more difficult, and I see it in the contents of the discussions on the Blue Card Directive, for example, which is a tool for highly skilled workers, and which is a category which, after all member states, or most of them, they want to attract. They might not say it so openly, but I think most member states are in favor of having attractive policies to attract highly skilled workers. And yet, we still have a lot of difficulties within the Council to have even just a Council mandate for the negotiations with the European Parliament. So, with restrictive approaches, not in all member states, but in several of them. So I think this is a clear signal that it is indeed not easy to develop policies in this area, and that the overall political context has a big impact. It has always been difficult to adopt legislation, to develop policies on legal and labor migration. This is not entirely new. I mean, we tried in the past. We had to withdraw a general proposal on legal migration for economic purposes because member states rejected it. So nevertheless, we did a lot. We have several directives in place that are enforced. But it remains very difficult, and I think there is a big question mark for the future, I think, at least if we look at the short, medium term. Now, as you know, we have launched, or you might know, but if not, I'm telling you, a big revision and assessment of our acquis on legal migration, what we call the fitness check. We have launched a public consultation yesterday, so I'll circulate to Sergio the link. And this will be a bit the basis for our reflection on the future to develop not only legislation, possibly new legislation on legal migration, but maybe to question ourselves about what kind of policies we should and we can develop at the European level on labor migration. Now, I'm already almost exceeding my time, but I wanted to say something, of course, on the external aspect and on the Valletta and the relations. I think what we have been trying to do also in the follow-up to the Valletta Action Plan was also to tell member states, okay, we acknowledge that responsibility for admission of labor migrants in terms of quotas is a member state's responsibility. This we do not contest. But let's try to see what we can do at European level to mutualize this, to put things together and use them in comprehensive relations with third countries. This hasn't really worked, or it has worked only to a limited extent. What we have managed to achieve and make progress on was as regards the legal channels for students. So the scholarships, we have double scholarships under Erasmus Plus and Marie Curie at European level. We have given more funding. And member states have also bilaterally increased their offers for scholarships and placements in their universities. This was done, but nothing really as regards labor migration. And what we are also facing now, even in a broader context, in the context of the partnership framework, the mobility partnership, is also a reluctance of member states even to make visible and to put together what they are already doing bilaterally somehow on labor migration, on legal migration with some third countries, because they also fear that somehow the Europeanization of this might undermine their bilateral relations with member states, which is another aspect which is difficult to deal with at European level. So, I mean, I don't want to end on a pessimistic note. As I said, I think we have been done a lot, especially in the last 2 months. One important thing on integration as well, because in spite of the crisis mood, we adopted an action plan on integration last year, which is not only a piece of paper, but which really allowed to mainstream integration across the Commission departments. We work very closely, both at service level, at commissioners level, with DG Employment, DG Education and Culture, regional, to put together all the tools, all the policies, all the measures, all the funding at the Commission at European level for integration. And I think this was really a step forward compared to what was achieved before. We have also done a lot to involve, and I'll finish here because I'm exceeding, with the local and regional authorities. I think this was mentioned here. Only this year we have invited some local and regional authorities of some member states to the meeting of the integration network, our meeting with national authorities, so that at least they meet, they talk to each other. We have organized a conference on the funding available for integration, not only under our AMIF program, but also under social funds and other funds. Putting together national managing authorities, local and regional authorities, so just to favor the dialogue, the interaction between the different levels of governance. And this, I think, is something also that was very much appreciated from the local and regional level. Of course, there is much to do. We have also an urban partnership on inclusion and integration under the urban agenda, which puts together cities, national governments, European commissions. There are a lot of other initiatives that are flourishing to bring closer the local and regional level to the national and European level on migration and integration. I will stop here, not to take too much time, but I'm happy to develop on one or the other points in the following debate. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. I'd now ask Rainer Munz to contribute. Thank you.
Thanks. Maybe we can turn off the light in the room a little bit, or dim it, so that you can see a bit more. Thank you, thank you, thank you. I just come I'm sorry, I have to apologize for not having been here in the morning. I just come from a conference with a relevant commissioner, a relevant minister of interior, a relevant head of a relevant agency, a few. And I was raising an issue, and I give you just to think about it. How many migrants are coming to Europe in a regular year? I'll come to this in a second. I'm going to find out now how it works. No. Yeah. So I start with a long view because we're talking about demography and labor markets. So this is the long view. When I was born in the 1950s, there were more than 2 times number of Europeans than Africans. So Africa was a totally underpopulated continent, which you can trace back to the also slave trade, and there might be other reasons for that. In the year 1995, so that's a bit more than 20 years ago, for the first time in modern history, or in recent history, say the last 10,000 years, more Africans than Europeans on our planet. And we're heading towards a future, it's not exactly clear how it's going to turn out, where we will have 4 billion Africans and maybe, I don't know, less than 700 million Europeans. This includes Russia and Ukraine, by the way. Now, the only thing we can be sure is that not all of these 4.2 billion Africans are going to live in Africa. So if we would take 2 million Africans every year over the next 100 years, then the number of Africans living in Africa would be just 4 billion instead of 4.2 billion. So this would make a huge difference. You would then have 200 million Africans plus their offspring, so maybe 300 million. Yeah. So that's the demographic situation we are in. It's also important to understand that in the short run, demography is not a driver of migration. You cannot say that if you have a quickly growing population, then this creates demographic pressure, and this demographic pressure translates into unemployment, and this unemployment is a major kick to bring people to other places. On the contrary, high population growth is concentrated in poor countries, and poor countries usually don't send a lot of migrants around. So when you look at, when you do a statistical analysis of bilateral migration flows, you get its geography. So Moroccans go to Spain because that's the next place to go. Just Mexicans to the US, so geography plays a role. Then it's colonial history. If you have been educated according to a French or a British curriculum in Africa, you tend to be rather oriented towards London or Paris than towards Amsterdam or Berlin. Then it's the size of the diaspora that plays an imminent role, which is linked to the first two already. And then it's violent conflicts. So if you want to explain short-term fluctuations, basically you look for conflict, and then explains a lot. Say Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Burundi, Rwanda, just to give you a flavor of a few names of the past. So I'm going to start with the stock of migrants. This is the, say, Mediterranean diaspora in Europe. The size of people born in Morocco, Tunisia, Algeria, Syria, Lebanon, and Egypt. And you immediately see there is a huge variation. Egyptians rather go to the Gulf states than to Europe. The Moroccans are the most prominent migrant group. So this is first generation diasporas. I'm not talking about children or grandchildren of people who come. So the size of this diaspora has an influence on the future flow as long as countries don't reach a certain level of GDP per capita, where then the migration flow goes into reverse or stops or whatever. So it's these elements, and you can explain Morocco, Tunisia, and Algeria by history, size of diaspora and geography, whereas Syria is something where the violent conflict element kicks in, and then you look at the Lebanese. There was more Lebanese coming in the 1990s when you had the civil war there. So let's go to the flow. When you look at the annual flows, you see that Ukraine is the most prominent sending country. Most people have no clue about it. And there's only two Mediterranean countries here. It's Syria and Morocco. And Syria is an exception because the flow of Syrians has receded, but just to Europe, not to Turkey, not into Jordan, not into Lebanon. It's just the EU-Turkey deal and the closure or relative closure of the Western Balkan route, which has made the flow of Syrians into the EU less likely. Let me then move to irregular migration. This is the main reason why we are talking about migration. It has basically, except for a few people who have been working on migration, like Andrew or Amanda or myself for the last, I think, 10, 15, 20, in my case, 30 years. The only reason why people are talking about migration is these people coming on dinghies. It's very important to see, this is the public perception. A migrant, if you ask about migrants today in Europe, people would say these are these Africans coming by boat to Sicily and Calabria. So if you look at the flows of the last, say, 8-9 years, you see we have seen arrivals in Italy, 670,000, arrivals in Greece, 1.15 million, arrivals in Spain, about 40,000 via the Mediterranean. So by sea, and that's only the Mediterranean, is 1.8 million, 1.85 million. And if you include arrivals by land, Morocco, Ceuta, Turkey, Bulgaria, or Greece, and the Atlantic route, so say Mauritania to the Canary Islands, you come to about 2 million people who have come in an irregular manner since the year 2009, say, on a Mediterranean or Africa-related route. It's important to see the size, to put it in perspective. The main routes are known here. I don't have to go into details. We have an Eastern and a Western African route, and then we had a route that comes from Afghanistan and South Asia via Iran and Turkey to Europe. There's, very important to note, not much overlap. So since we have closed the avenue from Turkey to Greece over the Eastern Aegean, you cannot see that the number of Syrians coming via Libya to Italy has increased in any way. The only nationality that has switched is people from Bangladesh. We see Bangladeshis coming now via the central Mediterranean, via Libya. But that's the only exception. So basically you can see these are two different migration systems that do not overlap, and the closure of one has no impact on the other. It's very important because the basic idea is also you close one, people will switch to the other. It has not happened. I'm not saying it's not going to happen. These are the flows over the Mediterranean that have been largely discussed. So we have started rescuing people in November 2013 with the operation Mare Nostrum, and we have seen a peak of arrivals in Greece. This is the brownish or yellow part, and the bluish part is over the Mediterranean, central Mediterranean, which clearly has a seasonality there, more in the summer, fewer in the winter. The overlooked category is irregular migrants arriving by airplane. This is the normal way an irregular migrant comes to Europe, so many more than over the Mediterranean path in the normal year. I'm not talking about the last 2 years. People get on a plane, usually have a visa or travel without visa if they come from have a visa-free nationality, and they get into Europe in a legal way and stay. So overstaying is the normal way you get into irregularity in Europe. It's not crossing the Mediterranean. Also, not very widely known here. So let me start with regular, irregular. I'm almost done here. This is the irregular flow that I have just shown. So part of these 2 million that we were just speaking, and you see it comes from a low 20,000 about 10 years ago and has dramatically increased. Yeah, so that's the main flow, and we don't know how much it's going to be in 2015, and you see that the flow basically has increased since we rescue people. So we have seen 65,000 coming since the January 2017. So this is about 27% more than last year. But the the amount of people coming to Europe is basically defined by the amount of rescue capacities that we are having. If we would put more ships there, then probably more people would be able to be transported. It's also important to see that there's very few, I'm sorry, there's a word missing, very few North Africans here. So the flow that comes in an irregular manner is basically people from sub-Saharan Africa. In particular, we have no Libyans here. And that's a big difference between the Syrian case and the Libyan case. This order in Libya just opens a gate, but doesn't bring Libyans to Europe. This order in Syria opens a gate, but brings the Syrians themselves. Now is the regular flow here. This regular flow used to be about 550,000 people in the past, and we are down to 400,000 people. Here, about half is sub-Saharan Africa, half is Northern Africa. And now the interesting thing is, every year the same number of Africans are coming to Europe. It's 600,000. Every year. In the past, it was 550,000 regular, 20,000, 30,000, 50,000 irregular. Today, we have 400,000 regular and 200,000 irregulars. But the absolute number of Africans coming to Europe, at least over the last 10, 12 years, is absolutely stable. I stop with a look into the future. When we can be sure that emigration from Africa with our development efforts will stop, but not anytime soon, because it's important to understand when you look at emigration flows, and if you assume that development goes that way from poor to rich, you see that the more countries develop themselves, the more people emigrate. And only after you have reached a threshold of about 5,000, 7,000, 8,000, 10,000 euros or dollars GDP per capita, then it recedes and immigration kicks in. Yeah? And that's the normal way. It's called an immigration, it's a migration hum. And so as most African countries are below this threshold from which it starts to recede, you can say if we start building roads and developing African countries, at least for a certain period of time, let's say 50 years, 70 years, 100 years, there will be more immigration. And then after that, it will recede. We don't know exactly how long it will take, but the European example, I think, is telling. Emigration from Europe has not started when we conquered the world in the 15th, 16th, 17th century, but only after the Industrial Revolution. We needed to build railways to the coast, we needed to build roads, we needed to have steamships, later airplanes. So people needed to get from a subsistence agrarian economy into a position where they could earn cash, enough cash, so that they could emigrate. And it was 70 million Europeans who have done this in the late 18th, 19th, and early 20th century. And it's important to understand that all our talks, let's develop Africa, let's address the root cause, and then migration will stop, is true, but it will take a generation, 2 generations, maybe 3 generations to kick in. That's very important not to forget, because otherwise, all these development efforts will falter if they are too closely linked to this idea that we only give the money or we only help African countries in order to make sure that nobody's going to leave. That's very unlikely. Yeah? Let's not fall into this trap. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Rainer. Mr. de Meester?
Okay, let me first start by thanking you for inviting also the private sector to participate in this discussion. It was announced that I'm working for the Federation of Enterprises in Belgium, just a couple of hundreds of meters from here. But actually, I'm here to represent also the international organization of employers based in Geneva. Now, as regards the employers' views on migration, well, basically our approach is a positive one. We see this as a positive and even a necessary phenomenon. And this is a bit contrary, as already explained earlier on, to how the public opinion perceives it these days. We think that inclusive growth and sustainable development require open markets, competitiveness and innovation. And all of these imply robust and coherent policies to facilitate the movement of people. Migration, we believe, is a vehicle for fulfilling personal aspirations, for balancing labor supply and demand, for sparking innovation, and for transferring and spreading skills. We believe it does in the interest of all stakeholders, including governments from countries of origin, countries of transit, countries of destination, and the business communities around the world, that we develop and implement coherent and comprehensive responses to the opportunities of migration. And I stress the word opportunities. I did not use the word challenges, and I will further develop on that later on. Private sector has a particular role to play in this regard, and last year the Global Forum on Migration and Development endorsed the creation of a business mechanism coordinated by the International Organization of Employers and the World Economic Forum. Its aim is to facilitate sustained interaction between migration policymakers and business leaders. We believe that our participation will help governments to better understand how migration policies and practices affect business operations at national level, as well as enable private sector representatives to actively contribute to migration policy debates by contributing their extensive experience and expertise on migration issues. Now, why do businesses have such an interest and such a stake in the success of this venture? And here the answer lies in the convergence of what are often characterized as separate business cases and human rights cases for ensuring fair, humane, and orderly migration systems. Now, let me first start with the business case. The need for labor migration and the integration of migrants in labor markets around the world is already urgent, and it will only grow in the coming years. Drivers are often demographic, but we know from statistics that labor migration can never be the solution for the aging challenge. A more important driver is the evolution in the world of work that requires workers with a different skill set that is often not present in the domestic labor market. We know that in 7 years from now, half of the jobs will be new jobs, that we don't know what jobs that will be today, or jobs with a different job content than now. In only 7 years, half of the jobs. This raises a need for high, low, and medium skilled foreign workers in a myriad of industries. And it requires agility. Agility is a characteristic that is often to be found in a migrant workforce. Now, I will not go into detail on high and low skill, but even if we have discussions with our business leaders or our CEOs, a lot of people have, I think, a little bit wrong frame set of what is low or high skilled. Because the definitions we still use or the characteristics are those based on the past. I will give you an example. An engineer that is no longer an engineer specialized in a specific field, that is no longer up to date with his knowledge and skills in that field, is low skilled. But yet, university diploma, we would qualify him as high skilled. But from a business perspective, in a labor market perspective, is low skilled. People lacking social skills or lacking, for example, agility as a characteristic, they are not high skilled, even if they have 2 or 3 university degrees. That's the reality in labor markets. Now, by filling labor market needs, immigrants increase productivity and raise consumption, generating additional jobs, etc. But, and here comes for me another very important driver, that is migrants, they, by their diversity, contribute to creativity and innovation, which for our businesses in Europe is extremely important if they want to be sustainable in the future. Another example here is, this is from a German machine manufacturer, who basically saw that they were losing market share, they were not innovative enough. So one day they found out that a lot of their older machines found a second and even a third life in other countries. Well, it was in Africa, let's be clear. So they basically started to import the genius, the creativity of those people that made their machines to turn those machines into something else. And that was something their own engineers, they all came from the same Fachschule, could not do, because they were all thinking alike. So this is the element of diversity, which I think is a very important one when it comes to innovation. But of course, labor markets are not necessarily equipped to employ migrants to their full potential. So better adapting labor migration systems to employers' need is important for all parties. Restrictive migration policies can have a negative impact on international skills mobility. Recruiting migrant workers may be costly, lengthy, and plagued by administrative uncertainties. And such dysfunction may also contribute in some cases to policy failures, for which both companies and policymakers share some degree of responsibility. We also have to look into our own way of behaving as a business community. Moreover, as the current refugee crisis demonstrates, both home and host labor markets can be significantly affected when large numbers of individuals are displaced from their home countries. But okay, we already also saw some of the figures. There is a lot of perception here also behind it, but anyway, something we have to take into account. Thus, engagement with employers can lead to better migration policy and better implementation. We believe the employer's responsibility here is not only to illuminate obstacles and help identify future needs, but also to do their share in workforce skills development, lifelong learning, upskilling, etc., etc. Engaging with employers can also help identify skills gaps in terms of language proficiency, formal skills, recognition of technical skills, mutual acceptation of technical skills, etc. Also, this is another example that not often comes to the table. Companies also can provide or are already providing modern communication technologies that improve connectivity between migrants and their left behind families. New technologies also foster transfer of knowledge, skills and experience and facilitate transnational business. In short, coordinated, well-regulated and well-managed migration policies are an essential part of a well-functioning labor market. And deeper engagement with the private sector is an important component in devising and implementing such policies. Those policies, we believe, are necessary to ensure the protection and promotion of human rights, and employers, again, here have an important stake in the ensuring of fair labor conditions and decent work for the migrant workforce. A responsibility, of course, that we do not only that is not only imposed on us as the business community, but that's something that we share with governments and trade unions. Employers as citizens, of course, also have an ethical stake. So I talked about the business case, but there's also the ethical dimension, ensuring that the communities in which they live do respect human righs. But the rights of migrants are far from being only an ethical responsibility. There is also, of course, a legal obligation and there is an economic impact. Abuse of migrant labor, human trafficking, unethical recruitment and supply chains that lack transparency can cause severe reputational and financial damage to companies. That is why we plea for level playing field. That is why we urge our captains of industry to show exemplary behavior, and that we jointly try to find ways to short circuit those what I often call cowboys that are actually using or abusing migrant labor and are involved in human trafficking. So we also think we can work on that together. But that brings me to some final remarks. As I said, we have a more positive approach. We see that we're surrounded by negative rhetoric that is having a devastating impact also on rational policy making. Migration is far too often associated with protectionism, terrorism, xenophobia, etc. And we should, I think, play a role in getting the better and the positive picture ahead. And that's why, for me, an important mechanism or an important principle to take into account is the Pareto principle. We can now, I talked about opportunities instead of challenges. You can start investing in tackling all the challenges that are associated with labor migration, but then you will spend a whole lot of effort for probably little result. If you invest the same amount of effort in human resources, in money, into opportunities, you are very likely to yield a much more positive and better result in the end. So maybe conclude, yeah, I have a list of instruments where business community is already working on things like fair recruitment, etc., etc. But I think I will just stop here and just repeat again that our line on this is labor migration, well managed, is a force for good. Thank you.
Amanda?
Thank you so much, and thank you to the previous two speakers. Kris and Reiner in particular have set the scene very nicely for my comments. I want to speak a bit more broadly and sort of look at this idea of who migrants are. This is something that Reiner mentioned, the public perception of migrants as being the crowded boats across the Mediterranean. I say now that the one very small silver lining over the last couple of years is that I'm no longer asked if I study birds when I say that I study migration, because everybody knows who migrants are now. But they only have an idea of what very small group of migrants are, right? And this is, whether it's implicitly stated or explicitly stated, we think of these ideal migrants. We think of desirable and undesirable migrants. We think of good migrants and bad migrants. And that's a lot of, when you look at the media, when you look at some policy statements that go out, you have this sort of statement, this implicit or explicit understanding of that. And so picking up a little bit on what Heather also said earlier today, we are all saying what great contributions migrants make to the economy, how they are needed. But many British voters said, many American voters said something different. They worry about cultural issues. They worry about security issues. They worry about migrants being a burden on the economy. And the thing is that these concerns do need to be recognized. They do need to be addressed. They do need to be refuted. And so I want to look a little bit more at the construction and the perception of these binaries. We do know that in economic terms and in terms of the economy and demographic change, all migrants are good migrants. They are needed. High-skilled, low-skilled, and it's interesting to hear your discussion of what is high-skilled and what is low-skilled. It's not just the OECD definitions. And this is something, whether the low-skilled, this is something that managers of summer vacation spots in the United States have been finding out over the last couple months. Because the Trump administration stopped the renewal of the H-2B visas. These are seasonal non-agricultural workers, so people who work in hotel industries. And they have been unable to find workers because it's hard work, it's long hours, and this is not something that native workers are doing. This is something that has become migrant labor. But the numbers are lower this year, and they're hurting. The other thing is it's starting to be harvest season in parts of the United States. And the rhetoric against undocumented migrants has affected not only undocumented migrant workers, but also others who fear that because of racial and ethnic profiling, they may get caught up in it. And so the workers in certain parts of certain agricultural areas aren't coming. And so crops are going to be rotting. Let's see what impact that has on prices in supermarkets and see what conclusions people draw out of that. So these are things that we know that low and medium skilled workers are needed. And I've given you two US examples, but the EU and Europe is no exception. There's just not this widespread perception. And that's something I was very glad to hear, that employers really do believe that migration is a force for good. And that's something that I had hoped in the lead up to the referendum in the UK, that employer associations might have spoken out a little bit more, because they certainly knew that migrants were needed. So one way that I do this in my research is to pose this question more specifically of who is a migrant and who is not a migrant. And most of us in this room here today, I'm going to say, are migrants. I don't know how many of you were born in Belgium, but the rest of us who live here are migrants. But we often subdivide this broad category of migrants into more specific categories. We talk about mobile EU citizens. Yes, I know that's a specific legal category, but even so, they're migrants. Expats or expatriates, international students, trainees, marriage migrants, and all of this. But we're all migrants, right? And yes, I mean, clearly, obviously, refugees have experiences that none of us it's very, very different experiences. But in terms of the perception, in terms of the way we think about presenting this to a receiving country, isn't it counterproductive to subdivide people this way and to sort of talk about some people are migrants and others are mobile in some other way? Is this useful for our discussions? Because when we speak about the higher skilled and the lesser skilled, aren't we implying some sort of value to the destination country? Or in the case of brain drain, a loss of value to the country of origin? And that's something that I do think we need to rethink how we approach these issues. The lesser skilled are clearly of value to the destination country. Just to pick up on just one element, more women are joining the labor force in many developed countries. And so we can talk about what's called the global care chain, where other women, migrant women, come in to take care of their children, come in to clean their houses and to cook the food, which is what women used to do. But now that women are, things like attaining PhDs and teaching and so forth, then this global care chain takes over, right? And this is something that Peoria already talked about in the 1970s, referring to the guest worker migration in Europe in the 50s and 60s, and saying that there were two labor markets. There's one that was labor intensive, and migrants were simply needed in that. And what those labor markets are have shifted a little bit, but we still need them today. But somehow politically they're a little bit unacceptable. And that's the challenge that we need to address. We also need to be aware of the multicausality in migration. My visa status in Belgium is that of a spouse of an EU citizen. So when you look at the data on marriage migration versus highly skilled migrants in Belgium, there's at least an undercount of at least one. And I'm going to venture the guess that there's a few more. And so this is something to think about. I was recently asked if I thought that security was a greater concern about migration now than earlier. And I would reiterate now what I said in response to that question, that native populations have always had security concerns about migrants. The nature of the security concerns may have changed, but whether it was safety of property against theft, whether it was personal safety, whether it was concerns over sexual violence, all of these have always been part of the discussion about migration. And the rhetoric has always been much more concerned than the reality. And so this question of security or of risk is something that clearly is part of the discussion, but does need to be put into the proportion that is a bit more appropriate. And that's something we do need to address as well. But Secretary Franken praised the United States earlier today over its planned and organized approach to migration. And so perhaps it's appropriate, I give my students a quote on integration, that the immigrants of today are not the same as earlier flows. They're never going to assimilate. They're dividing America, and America is not going to be the same. And then I asked my students at the beginning of the course, when is this date from? When is this from? And they tend to think that it's recent. But of course, it was not referring to recent migration, but to very old migration. And they were referring to Southern Europeans and Eastern Europeans who were Catholic and who were Jewish, and who were not the Protestant Northern Europeans that had formed the majority of the migrants to the United States at that point. They might have been referring to my Polish grandfather, except for he came in irregularly in the 1930s. So let's not get too much into the United States being, and I'm not even going to mention the internment of 100,000 Japanese Americans during World War II. Today in Europe, of course, many people say the same thing, that cultural distance is too great, that assimilation is not possible, and I would simply refer them to the integration of Polish and Catholic, and so Jewish Catholic, Southern Europeans, Eastern Europeans in the United States today. Of course, its concern over immigration and integration in the 19-teens in the United States was followed by the closing of doors. The 1921 and 1924 National Origins Quota Acts did effectively stop migration. Again, my grandfather came in irregularly, but I'm hoping that Europe and the US don't make the same mistake again. But that instead we realize that all migrants have the potential to contribute to the societies that they're coming to. And subdividing reflexively on the basis of reason for migration, on level of education or skill of education or recent qualifications and recent updates of skill level is not particularly productive. And I really do make a plea to think of migration in a more holistic manner and to think of the contributions, and then we can move on to the different categories. I'll stop there. Thank you very much.